This is the first presentation for Week 3. It is titled Founding Documents, Meaning and Application, and includes a brief survey of some parts of the Revolutionary War. This lecture will in places note comments from the excellent book by Gordon Wood, The Creation of the American Republic, 1776 to 1787. On this slide, Wood notes the Republican spirit, the Republican political beliefs that emerged from the Enlightenment. On this slide, Wood introduces us to the concept of republicanism, which was a growing belief in Europe and eventually the American colonies for representation of the people in the governance of a nation. But there were two kinds of Republican. There was the old Whig republicanism of the colonial gentry, informed by the liberal thought of John Locke. One of the most important radical wing in the American Revolution is Thomas Paine. The radical character of the republicanism that the revolutionaries adopted in 1767 the revolution broke with its stress on corruption, luxury, this slide gives background information, and the public good on Thomas especially Paine struck Wood as being at odds with the individualistic and rights-oriented liberalism early 1776 one scholar had claimed lay at the heart for independence from Britain, with their stress on communal values. That work, as much as anything else, please keep in mind, and we'll look at the next slide, two kinds of republicanism. Many colonists. Final note on this slide, whether old or radical, republicanism was the ideology that he also served in the Revolutionary War. Liberty was the watchword, and especially among the radical Whigs and the next, who sought participation in the government by a broader swath of the population. Important information about Thomas Paine. And indeed, this slide notes that once Paine had been very involved with the American Revolution, he was actually recruited or voted into the French Revolution that occurred a little bit later, and almost lost his life somehow when his time was up to head to the guillotine. He was overlooked. He wrote important works during this time, and really was a major historical figure at this time, both in the U.S. colonies and in Europe. Common Sense sold more than 150,000 copies, which in that day was a major blockbuster, within 3 months. And as George Washington stated, common sense is working a powerful change in the minds of men. The mental change mentioned by Washington was a powerful shift. The colonists had spent a great deal of time blaming Parliament for the problems, but Paine argued that it was King George, and that nothing short of a break with the crown would suffice. And on June 7th, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia put forth a resolution for independence, stating that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. And the resolution was seconded by John Adams. We will note later on another famous Lee from Virginia. This slide notes the two famous Lees of the American Revolution. Richard Henry Lee was a member of the Second Continental Congress and signer of the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation, as was his brother Francis Lightfoot Lee. And then we have Light Horse Harry Lee, a Revolutionary War general who married Anne Hill Carter of Shirley Plantation. We saw Shirley Plantation last week. Governor of Virginia and U.S. Congressman. He is the one in the funerary eulogy of George Washington famously said that Washington was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. One of his sons was Robert E. Lee. the best-known Confederate general during the Civil War. Robert E. Lee had married Mary Anna Randolph Custis, the great-granddaughter of Martha Custis Washington, the wife of George Washington, and through whom Robert and Mary Lee inherited the Arlington property, which is now a famous national military cemetery near Washington, D.C., Arlington Cemetery. That was once Robert E. Lee's property. Here is a timeline to put significant events in chronological order. The Declaration of Independence was primarily drafted by Thomas Jefferson and adopted famously by the Second Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776. Although others may have perhaps contributed something, generally Jefferson gets the credit for the document. This slide notes some background to the Declaration of Independence as primarily constructed by Thomas Jefferson. You have an assignment this week concerning John Locke. We covered John Locke in a little more detail last week, so you can rely on those that PowerPoint as well. But this just summarizes some important points of John Locke's political philosophy. This is a very important distinction to make about rights. In the Declaration of Independence, the rights referred to by Jefferson were not rights granted to Englishmen, but rather, as Enlightenment thinkers argued, rights derived from nature or laws of nature. In other words, they do not derive these rights from English law. They are natural rights. Here is another famous painting from the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C., of the signing of the Declaration of Independence by John Trumbull. I believe it also appears on the reverse of our $2 bills, which we don't often see too much in our daily lives. At the same time that the Declaration of Independence was signed, it was decided that there should be a committee drawn up to come up with a seal for the United States. And that initial committee, formed the very same day, July 4th, 1776, was made up of Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. We note how much both Adams and Jefferson are involved in this process of independence. They came up with the motto, E pluribus unum, out of many, one, which originally applied to the plurality of states or colonies that were becoming states. And there's some more information on here. I especially note philosophically an issue that is always on my mind, the problem, the tension of the one, capital O, versus the many. And the United States motto directly addresses that tension. The next two slides give direct quotes from the Declaration of Independence, which you might find helpful. The Declaration of Independence ended all possibilities of reconciliation with Great Britain and was the real turning point of the Revolution. The war, however, had technically begun with the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord in 1775, and also the famous Battle of Bunker Hill took place in 1775. As the Continental Congress was meeting to declare independence, the British were landing at Staten Island, New York City area. And by mid-August of that year, under the leadership of General William Howe, had some 32,000 men under his control. It was the largest force the British had ever deployed. This slide notes that, first of all, we must keep in mind that not everyone in the colonies wanted to break with the British. wanted to become independent. The colonials were not in great shape to fight such a major military force. One of the most significant victories for the colonists came in 1777 at the Battle of Saratoga. And this slide gives you some information on that. And then the next slide you have. I want to introduce at this point a new arrival during the Revolutionary War. His name was Albert Gallatin. In 1780, during the war, a 19-year-old from Geneva, Switzerland, arrived in America, having a letter of introduction from America's diplomat in France, Benjamin Franklin, the earliest and oldest of America's founders. That's Franklin. The French-speaking, Rousseau-influenced young man desired to live where new thought was shaping a nation. Twice, he even joined the military component of the American Revolution after his arrival. And you can read more about Albert Gallatin's background there in the under background. Continuing the story, after his enlistments in the military, he found employment teaching French at Harvard. His name was Albert Gallatin. We will watch his progress, for he is considered by current author Joseph Ellis as the last of America's founders. These slides, the next few slides, give some detailed information about how the Revolutionary War ended. From July 1778 until the summer of 1781, that is 3 years, Washington did not engage in a significant battle, that's General Washington, but remained with his army in the north, indecisive about invading Canada or attempting to retake New York City. As a result, the British severely attacked the South, southern colonies. Georgia fell. Actually, Georgia was lost. And South Carolina was on the brink. Horatio Gates suffered a humiliating defeat. About that time, in 1780, 6,500 French troops led by Rochambeau set foot in Rhode Island, up to the north. Though friendly with Washington, Rochambeau knew that Washington was off track in his wavering future plans. They waited out the winter. Then, incredibly, a new congressionally authorized Continental Army force under the command of Nathanael Greene, with the assistance of Daniel Morgan's Rifle Regiment, began a magnificent campaign through the South, little noticed at the time. Quote, in the course of roughly 70 days between Christmas and March 1781, Greene, though dogged with a dearth of supplies and leading a small ragtag band of Continentals and militia, conducted the most masterful sustained campaign by a commander in the War of Independence. Daniel Morgan solidified his fame with his victory at the Battle of the Cowpens. The Continental force drove Cornwallis out of the Carolinas into Virginia. Coincidentally, Rochambeau instructed the French Navy, under the command of de Grasse, to proceed to the Chesapeake. He did this without telling Washington, who still had intentions on New York City. French General Lafayette's contingent of the Continental Army established itself at the Virginia Chesapeake to block sea access for Cornwallis. On September 5th, 1781, the Battle of the Virginia Capes, which was, quote, a showdown that has been called the most important naval engagement in the 18th century, occurred. De Grasse's French Navy defeated the British ships near the Chesapeake. Note, this is a French versus British battle on behalf of the U.S. colonies. Washington's and Rochambeau's armies, receiving some news of what was occurring to the south, left the area of New York City and finally arrived from the north. Shelling of the British ensued. Hemmed in with nowhere to escape, Cornwallis was forced to surrender. Washington received the lion's share of the credit. 3 French military commanders were significantly involved in all of this, with 2 American generals succeeding greatly, Greene and Morgan. Rochambeau and de Grasse joined Washington at the surrender. That's how it ended. The war was officially ended in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. This slide notes how the Articles of Confederation were finally adopted. This slide notes the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. And in your learning activities for week 3, you have a video that covers the weaknesses of the Articles in the movement toward a new document, the Constitution. I note here once again the slide on the 3 political views, because whereas the radical Whigs had a document that they could really get behind in the Declaration of Independence, there was the period between 1776 and 1787, what's that, 21 years, where things, especially after the war, weren't going the way many thought they should. The new governance under the Articles and in light of the Declaration of Independence. And so other interests of a less radical nature began to make their presence felt in the construction of the new document, the U.S. Constitution. This slide notes the beginning of the Constitutional Convention. This slide notes the problems that were arising under the Articles of Confederation. A democratic republic based on natural rights saw the election of untrained and inexperienced people into government positions. Thus, local interests were being favored over national interests and the national good. And popularly elected state legislatures were violating property rights, and anarchy was beginning to emerge, or at least feared. The national government was clearly too weak. Thus, the gentry, that is, those who previously had been understood as a higher status in society, met at Philadelphia to rein in the chaos. And thus we will follow a historical tug-of-war over the following decades, with Washington, Hamilton, and Adams forming a certain political bloc, and then after them Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin, that young man we just met, and Monroe is part of that group, and then back to the more conservative views of Quincy Adams, John Quincy Adams, and then finally Andrew Jackson, which leads into your book report. In the republics, in this late 18th century period, established by both the American and French revolutions, mob-rule democracy eventually took place, at least in areas. Chaos ensued, and the futures of both republics were in danger. As theologian Francis Schaeffer has noted in the past, chaos is an occasion for an arbitrary elite to take the reins of power. In France, that elite took the form first of the Reign of Terror and its march to the guillotine, and then of Napoleon Bonaparte, wherein much of Europe suffered. In America, the old Whigs, that gentry group I just mentioned, amazingly constructed an elite document, the Constitution, that was non-arbitrarily ratified by the people of the states, saving the republic from both a reign of terror and or the reign of a tyrannical elite, or at the very least, saving the republic from dissolving and then being picked apart by Britain, France, and Spain. Washington was chosen as the convention president, and most of what we know about the convention comes from James Madison, who's considered the father of the Constitution. As the convention proceeded, a number of questions and suggestions were provided, which caused the delegates to question if they should amend the Articles of Confederation or create something brand new, and two plans were proposed. This slide notes the two plans that were proposed, and also the problem of the institution of slavery and how that was affecting the discussions. This slide notes the 3/5 compromise of the United States Constitution. However, this did not solve the problem of the institution of slavery, which is going to fester and finally become the big issue of the 19th century. Finally, the Constitution was drafted and agreed upon, but it would not take effect until it was ratified by 9 states. One reason for the delay was the issue of rights. And the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments were not a part of the original Constitution. So this slide gives some basic information about the Constitutional Convention and when things took place. The Constitution, in a sense, was meant or pointed in the direction of solving the problem of the one and the many. The one, in this case, would be the federal government, the many, the state governments. Eventually, Madison, who was behind so much of the Constitution, drafted the Bill of Rights to be added to the Constitution. And then it was ratified. Now this slide notes a difference between the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. And we're looking at a difference here of 21 years. It's a difference between Locke's individualism, which is protected by the newer Constitution, and anti-corruption radical republicanism, which is asserted by the Declaration of Independence, and in fact has a lot of Locke behind it as well. Indeed, in my study of the history of the United States, we really see a gradual acceptance of what was first declared in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, an idealistic, natural rights-based document. And the history is taking those basic rights and having them clearly protected in the U.S. Constitution as time goes on. Because many at the convention did not embrace the concept of natural rights, but rather British inherited rights. Thus, in U.S. history, we can follow this movement to make what was declared in the Declaration of Independence good and equal for all people. And thus, over time, we have these amendments to the Constitution to recognize the rights of others. If one studies colonial history, one will notice next to a name such as George Washington's an abbreviation, GENT, which is short for gentleman. He's a member of the gentry. He's aristocratic. He's entitled to some privilege that others don't have. The U.S. Constitution did away with that. And in fact, you will see those titles disappearing after the War for Independence. In order to get the states to ratify the Constitution, 3 people wrote articles in newspapers to defend the Constitution with the purpose of encouraging ratification by the states. Those 3 authors were John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. And here you have some information on each of these. As was noted before, the original draft of the U.S. Constitution did not include a Bill of Rights. Those were eventually drawn up by James Madison and satisfied the doubts of many in the process.